What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our panelists first, just so we understand who's in the room. We're going to then ask a few questions that we'll have everyone respond to, and then we'll have some questions that maybe speak more to their specific areas of expertise. And given the time, I may invite the audience into that right away. So just to start out, we have Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez is the Richard D. Hefner Professor in Communications and Public Policy at Rutgers University. He's my colleague in our department, proud of that. Co-host of the daily morning news show Democracy Now! He was a staff columnist for nearly 30 years at New York's Daily News, where his reports on urban affairs, the environment, and race relations garnered numerous honors, including 2 George Polk Awards. His publications include, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, also News for the People, The Epic Story of Race in the American Media, and he's done so much, and I think a lot of us are familiar with his work. We also have Helen Ginn. She's been a Philadelphia council member since 2016. She's a longtime education and community organizer and is the first Asian American woman elected to the Philadelphia City Council. As chair of council's Children and Youth Committee, she's helped lead a public schools agenda that contributed to the end of the 17-year state takeover of the school system. And I just want to say, with all the panelists, I have my own personal gratitude to them. Helen has been involved in every time I've seen something that's in the city related to workers, related to a radical agenda. Helen has been out there in front of it, and you'll get a little taste of that today. And then finally, we have Mark Lamont Hill. Is the Steve Charles Professor of Media, Cities, and Solutions at Temple University, an award-winning journalist. Dr. Hill has received numerous prestigious awards from the National Association of Black Journalists, GLAAD, the National Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. There's so much here. But I just want to say he's the co-author of 4 books, Beats, Rhymes in the Classroom, Hip Hop Pedagogy, Black Life in America, Nobody, Casualties, America's War on Vulnerable, From the Freedom from Flint to Beyond, and Gentrifier. And I just want to say 2 things quickly about Mark, who really made the time to be here and amongst, like we all did in this busy schedule. One is that when it comes to navigating, kind of being a media personality, so many of us have seen people who sacrifice their radical politics to do that, right? Or sacrifice a certain kind of intellectual rigor. And I think Mark has been, when people ask me how I'm trying to navigate it, I go, I'm basically trying to be like Mark, because of the way in which he doesn't do that. The second thing is that he's also started, and this is not included in the official bio, but he's led the creation of Uncle Bobby's and a whole community sort of ecosystem of radical learning in my neighborhood. And I don't think I've ever seen a community form that quickly around those kind of ideas as that is. So I encourage everybody to do that. So really excited with that, and let's get off to it. So we've seen a number of these things talked about today, and I guess I just want to have everybody respond to an idea, considering the themes of this conference and this political moment. I want you to reflect on what really is standing out to you as the primary problems you think that we're confronting, and particularly, if you could speak, you could maybe think about what roles activism and scholarship and journalism. I don't expect everybody to respond to all 3 of those, but the ones that really speak to you, could you tell us how you think those things contribute to that to confronting those social problems? We start with Juan.
Well, good evening to everyone. And I know it's been a long day, and there's been a lot thrown at us, and a lot of food for thought. I think that a couple of things, I don't want to repeat things that other folks have said. I think, to my mind, for those of us who are journalists and concerned about equity and social justice, there are a couple of things that have not really been mentioned at all in these last 2 days that I think are crucial to understanding a lot of what we're trying to deal with. One is the question of empire, right? That we live in the most powerful imperial power that has ever existed in the world. And that much of the problems that we've been talking about and dealing with, the real backdrop to it is that an empire that is increasingly intensifying its attempt to control the rest of the world. the migration problem that Naomi talked about, not just, of course, in the United States, but across the world, is largely a result of the intensification of imperial domination in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Latin America. In my book, Harvest of Empire, I talk about this reality that the advanced industrial world is trying to tackle with the results of its empires. England doesn't know what to do about all the Pakistanis and Jamaicans and Indians. Germany doesn't know what to do about all the Turks. France doesn't know what to do about all the Algerians and Moroccans and Tunisians. And the United States doesn't know what to do about all the Latin Americans. The reality is that post-World War II, the people of the Third World came to the West because all their wealth had been taken, and then they had been impressed into the wars, and they naturally began to gravitate to their imperial masters. So why are so many Latin Americans coming to the United States? Because that was the original colonial empire, dominated empire of the United States. And same with the Algerians and the Tunisians and Moroccans and France and so forth. So I think the empire is still with us. And I think that we as journalists have trouble sometimes bringing that history to our readers and listeners and explaining to them that there's a reason why so many people are on the move. And then, of course, you add to that the climate change and the growth in equality, and the growth in the wealth gap. What was it? Oxfam said 26 billionaires today have more wealth than 3.8 billion people on planet Earth. That's an unsustainable situation. That cannot continue. So what's happened, the motions of people is a result of these empires and what they have created, either through exportation of weapons, through seizures of other previously markets that were not under their control. So I think that that's one issue, empire. The other issue is, and I know people don't like to talk about this, is fascism. Precisely because the empires have become to increasingly exacerbate their control of these countries, there's popular resistance, and now we are seeing this incredible explosion of authoritarian governments across the world. Duterte in the Philippines, al-Sisi in Egypt, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States. So we are moving toward increasingly authoritarian forms of government. Now, fascism will not declare itself. It will not say one day we are a fascist state. But rather what happens is fascism develops in the process of first grabbing power through the existing electoral means. And then gradually people come to accept fascism before they even realize it's there. And I think what Caitlin was talking about how the analytics of our workplaces, how our employers are tracking us, the surveillance state, we've come to accept this. It's far easier to institute a fascist state today than it ever was before. And it will be less visible to the population when it happens. And, I want to quote a great scholar who was here at the University of Pennsylvania. A lot of people have forgotten him since he passed away, George Gerbner. In 1981, George Gerbner testified before Congress and about the role of the media in promoting violence and insecurity in the population. And I want to just read this quote. This was 1981. And Gerbner said to Congress at the time, "Fearful people are more dependent, more easily manipulated and controlled, more susceptible to deceptively simple, strong, tough measures and hardline postures. They may accept and even welcome repression if it promises to relieve their insecurities. This is the deeper problem of violence-laden television." So the reality is, and we are guilty of this even in the left media, of concentrating on the conflicts and the insecurities that people have, because then they will depend on us more for information, rather than give context, history, and narratives of people who are actually collectively effectively changing society. So I think that this is the one thing that I would urge all of us to do, in addition to the structural changes that must be done in the system and the locality of news, is we have to give context, we have to give history, and we have to focus on the examples of victories. I mean, it was great to hear the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. I wrote the first article in the New York media when Ravi Desai and the New York Taxi Workers Alliance launched their first strike 23 years ago. And I've always highlighted their work because they were such an inspiration to workers in New York City. So I think that that's the key thing that I would take out of this. Let's not forget the empire that's at the source of everything that's going on, problems in the world. And let's not fool ourselves that we are on the cusp, not in the advanced countries of the world and in some of the developing countries of the world, of moving into fascist states unless we are more seriously figure out how to educate the people of what's actually going on. So.
Hi, everybody. So I guess I would start by talking a little bit about the organizing tradition that I think we kind of need to bring back to life beyond labor. So I come out of communities for whom politics traditionally doesn't work. I represent Asian American communities, largely outside the political structure, immigrant communities who are fodder for a for-profit private prison industry and a deportation machine. I come out of public education communities in this city for whom this state and this city was willing to write off. And out of these, but I also come out of communities for whom, like in the midst of all of that, we find power in our own ability to tell the stories that we have not been able to hear. And, you know, especially in immigrant communities, our stories are never written down in our immigrant communities. So like the folk tale tradition, the folklore that comes down and is passed down to us is like one of the most essential means for which we transmit a sense of culture, language, history, tradition, understanding of elders and of roots, and that these things are extraordinarily powerful because organizing traditions have to go back to those things. I tell a lot of people, like when we built things at Asian Americans United, one of my homes, one of the things that was ingrained in me early on was the ability for us to tell our victories along with our losses, because no one else would tell those stories. No one else would remind us that in moments of great like pain and agony that we can look back and draw upon a history of winning. You know, in Chinatown, for example, when we were fighting a stadium and we had like Major League Baseball and all the elected officials and developers lined up on one side and limited English-speaking communities on the other side, that, you know, we go back to these storytelling of how Chinatown fought off different, you know, pushed under the 676 freeway with like, you know, a dozen activists standing in front of a bulldozer at that time. We remind ourselves, you know, we are grateful for stories of other communities because our community is so small. So we have to look out to the stories of other communities, the folks who fought the Black Bottoms. So thank God for like people like Walt Palmer who came to us and told us to fight like hell and reminded us what the story of the Black Bottoms was, and people like Rosemary Kubas, who has passed, but helped lead a huge neighborhood council that brought hundreds and hundreds of neighborhoods, people representing different neighborhoods into a large community in the 1980s, and held rallies and councils to figure out a broad neighborhood agenda, so that these moments when you face off against almost impossible circumstances, you have to draw on the organizing tradition that brings you back. Too often, I think organizing has been defined as labor, and we struggle with labor right now. We're going to have to build out and draw upon new organizing traditions, and that these things come out of immigrant communities. These things can come out of public education and other types of places. But to me, that is where we start. And second, I guess I would think about, in the ways in which the struggle is so big. So I think we have language, analysis, and some amount of rhetoric to understand the forces that are working against us at scale. But we have to go and solve these problems at the local level. Actually, the restoration of our community and the breakdown of our civil society is not the things that are happening up to scale. It's what is breaking down in our own communities. And I'll talk about it from the point of our public schools. So Philadelphia is the poorest large city in the country. You are in the state, which is the worst in the nation when it comes to the funding gap between the poorest and wealthiest school districts. And you don't need any kind of statistic to understand what that looks like, because all you need to do is go from one school in Strawberry Mansion to another school 5 miles away in Lower Merion and see the difference of the breakdown. And, this is, as I said earlier, this is a city that was willing to write off its public school system 6 years ago. We had closed down 24 public schools. We laid off 4,000 staff people. We had wiped out nurses and counselors. We didn't even have secretaries during the summer to register kids for school. We had 2 kids die in schools without school nurses. And we had parents fight on their own. So parents, young people, educators had to do the pushback because we had a mayor, we had a governor, and we had a city council and a legislature that had written us off. The politics wasn't going to work for us. The status quo was never going to be defining how we were going to define our struggle. We had to break the limits of what's possible to win. And so that doesn't, that kind of breakdown and the breakdown within communities is defined at this local level, the fight at school by school. The racial breakdown happens at the school by school level. Public institutions starved into dysfunction, not only in the poorest large city, but in the most marginalized and most vulnerable communities. And our failure to understand that we have to fight this at the local level to restore a sense of trust, to bring back our schools, is in fact the biggest challenge. So I often say when they go low, we go local. And that, this idea of restoration of civic democracy, of functioning public institutions, of elevated community leadership, and of changing local politics is actually the most powerful thing that we have, because it just seems so big, everything seems so big, but when we bring it back home, when we talk about what's happening in our neighborhoods and in our communities, then we feel like we have power again. We have ownership. We have a place of entry and engagement. And I want to say, the steps to bring our public schools back to health didn't start, again, in city halls or state legislatures, and certainly not in DC. But within our backyards and barbecues and recess yards, schoolyards, parent-teacher meetings, and places where people restored back a sense of value and vision to public education. And then that powers political movements. Politics follows movements. And my election into city council was certainly a reflection of a movement of people that I had been part of, but also was being pushed along by. And when we got into power, obviously, you've got to prove not only that you can win something, but that your winning makes a difference. And from the moment, we came in, it was very clearly restoring nurses and counselors back into every public school, doubling the number of social workers in schools, working with young people to fight for water access in the 21st century and remind ourselves that we still have to fight for environmental justice and that we can win it in our public schools and do $1 million clean water campaign for every public school in the city. It means we can end suspensions in grades K to 2. It means we can bring back instrumental music programs, and it also means you can finally end the 17-year state takeover and restore local control, but not for the sake of just saying it, but for the fact that we can prove that by local control, civic democracy, and engaged public, things change. We transform what's happening at the local level, and that we fuel the movements that bring us closer to justice. So I'll stop there.
Feels super short. Hey, good evening, everybody. Hey, I'm mad I went last. This has been incredibly exciting to hear. I wish I could have been here for the entire event today and even yesterday. Sounds like I missed an extraordinary set of conversations. There's so many problems. As we were talking and thinking, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me, though, is the crisis of capital. And I think this particular junction in history is one where we are being forced to wrestle with and confront the reality that the contradictions of capitalism right now are so deeply entangled and so intense that we're only going to see more and more social misery for the vulnerable, and fewer mechanisms by way of the journalistic project of addressing it. As you were talking about empire, I was thinking, sure, I agree with you 1,000%. And looking at the kind of imperial ambition of the United States, even at this junction, is depressing. And in the post-World War II context, as the center of power kind of shifts from London to New York, one of the things that animates that shift is a different set of economic arrangements. All of the dictatorships and authoritarian governments that you brilliantly laid out. I'm still bugging that I'm on a panel with you because I admire you so much, both of you. I get to see Helen more often, so it's, but it still inspires awe. But as you were talking, I was thinking about sort of the way that arrangements of capital, and particularly capitalism, sort of enables the kind of imperial project that you're talking about so masterfully, and how considerations of economic efficiency at this moment, as much as anything else, and we can talk about white nationalism and white supremacy more broadly in a second, but those things also shape the treatment of Romanis in Italy, or the treatment of Algerians in France, or the treatment of Mexicans here, or the treatment of Eritreans in Israel, or the treatment, and we can go on down the list, or Sudanese. And so I think we have to have a kind of robust conversation about that, because while I don't have a crude sort of materialist analysis of it, I would argue that many of the problems we're wrestling with, even in schools, right, this privatization question, only happens when an obsession with market efficiency makes us say that certain kinds of schools are bad for business. Certain kinds of, the public itself becomes bad for business, public school, public housing, public transportation. The public itself becomes seen as a kind of enemy to a very narrow technocratic economic understanding of what value is. And we begin to see people as commodities. We see that in our universities, right? I mean, all of these things are, dissent, radicalism is bad for business, right? Saying the wrong thing on cable news, for example, bad for business. And no, right? So this becomes part of what we have to wrestle with. But the challenge is that because capitalism is so deeply entrenched in our imaginations, as someone said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world itself than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And if you're operating from that vantage point, then the solutions we look to become much more reform-driven than they are anything radical or revolutionary. Our way of imagining new schools is to think of how within this same, how we can have an Obama approach versus a Bush approach, right? Which, how can we race to the top rather than leave no child behind, right? And both of which are still using market logic and market metaphors to get us somewhere, so it doesn't exactly work. Having an analysis, though, of empire, having an analysis of xenophobia, of racism, of anti-Semitism, all these things can be challenging within a media landscape that gets smaller and smaller and smaller because more and more people buy up more and more stuff. So those same way 36 billionaires are controlling, 36 billionaires are controlling billions of people. Look at what happens when Viacom or Time Warner or whomever buys up more and more territory, what happens in the radio market, where instead of having hundreds of local radio stations, where you could have public radio, where you could have a small black-owned radio station, where you could have local discourse about what's going on. All of these things are getting swallowed up by conglomerates. And so even if you have 6 channels, they're owned by 2 people. And so you're having the same conversation in each place, none of which will get at the fundamental question. So you can talk about the problem with prison, but you can't talk about abolition, right? You can talk about 2-state solutions, you can't talk about 1-state solutions, right? You can talk about, and it's not even about what the right answer is, just the fact that there's not even the possibility of having the conversation. We can talk about schools, but when we talk about reimagining distribution of tax, reshaping and reimagination, redistribution of the tax base in such a way that we could imagine equality or equity rather in more honest ways. We don't even have space for the conversation. And I think for me, that is what has been most frustrating at this moment in history. I could say more, but I want to pause. I want to make sure we get everybody in. Nah, man. You know, I can talk again.
All right. In light of time, and I think what I'm going to do is I have some questions I want to ask to focus on specific things, but I think I want to start with just open it up to the audience right away. Just keeping in mind these tremendous interventions about empire, about the importance of local politics, about the shrinking of even radical spaces where we can even talk about, have these real conversations. I mean, so yeah, any questions? Okay, yes, in the back.
So can you tell me the main reason why you wouldn't join the conglomerate that is growing, and you would prefer to oppose and build your own little shop that you would hope to become as powerful in the future?
In which context? In the media context?
In any context.
Let me just say something too, and I want to definitely make sure we answer your question. I want to start out always. Never bad to remind as we discuss these sense issues to make sure we remain respectful of each other and come to that agreement. And secondly, let's also try to get more. The briefer our comments and answers are, the more people we can get in. So just haven't thrown that out.
And that's not particular to you. That's
no, not at all. No.
Yeah, just to be clear.
Yeah.
You said why not join why remain independent?
What's the main reason that you would think I will oppose that power versus join them?
I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, in some ways we have joined them, right? I mean, you're in city council. I worked for CNN, and I work at a major university. I mean, it ain't like I'm, you know what I mean? But at the same time, I think for me, I still have a fundamental and abiding belief in the people. And I still believe that organized people can defeat these organized power structures. Look at Sudan just yesterday. I mean, who could have seen that coming even a month ago? I mean, maybe they could have, but it was almost unimaginable, certainly 6 months ago, that Omar al-Bashir would be out. But there's a way to defeat these people. And for me, the reason why there's value in defeating as opposed to just joining them, whoever them is that there are values, there are ideals, and there are real lives at stake. And I'll give you an example. Why vote green for me? Because I believe, not in Jill Stein, clearly, but in a political agenda. And my freedom dream, as Robin Kelly said, my radical imagination is more ambitious, I hope, than the Democratic Party. I could join them and be part of a reform movement, but I'd like to imagine something different, something that can produce a different outcome. And even if we lose, whether it's an election, whether we get swallowed up by somebody else, the resistance itself produces perhaps some relief. It stops a complete move to the right. It saves some lives. It's not an abstract thing for me, it's a very material thing. And at a moment where the local spots of resistance are being swallowed up, and that was probably the other thing I would have said, is part of what this neoliberal moment does also is not only does it hold the public sort of in contempt at the abstract and theoretical level, but it also destroys pieces of the public. So the Amazonification of the world destroys the local bookstore. The Starbucksification of the world destroys the local mom and pop cafe. Not just here, but globally. I mean, think about what that happens in Latin America. Think about what that happens in the continent of Africa. And so you lose local culture, you lose local value, you can lose part of the resistance if you give way wholeheartedly to that which might be more lucrative. So for me, the point of resisting and the point of not, you can't beat them, join them thing is, we can beat them. Mm-hmm. And even if we lose, the victory's in the struggle. Yeah.
So I would say that I'm not as diplomatic as Mark. So I'm like anti-authoritarian by nature. So on a personality level, that doesn't really fit. But second of all, like I don't know if I was clear enough. So like join them was destruction of our public schools. To repeat, thousands of teachers laid off, no nurses and counselors, children dying, schools shut down, communities abandoned. Join them from an immigrant perspective is our people being in indefinite detention, people dying and being beaten, children in cages in the 21st goddamn century, and all manner of abuse and xenophobia is not even the right word anymore. It's fomenting of racialized violence. Join them is about police brutality in our streets, the reorienting of city budgets on surveillance and brutality, and incarceration and, everything that destroys people's inhumanity. Joining them means destruction of our voting rights, the undoing of democracy. The only way we were able to do the things that we were able to do in our public schools is because we didn't have a goddamn local school board. It took a state takeover and the eradication of voices of democracy in order to allow those kinds of abuses to happen and those kinds of human rights to go uncontested. So, what are we trying to, there is something, and I think Mark did a really important thing, how do you breathe in this moment? And I think a lot about how you breathe in this moment is you have to push back as hard as you can to shove away and deny space so that communities can breathe for a second, so that we can speak in our languages, to go back to our people, to reorganize, tell our stories, and then gear up for the big fight ahead. Because if you can't push back on that space, you can't figure out the solution because it's so much is happening all at once. And I think that's one of the things that this idea of the capitalist market being, it is disguised as the natural order of things. Gentrification is disguised as the natural order of things. Power and wealth accrued to Harvard grads is disguised as the natural power of things, natural order of things, and that this sense of inevitability is what is being rooted in to allow these things to occur when they would not be tolerated in a civil society that had time to really think about where we are going. And so, the way to do it is to throw a fucking cog in the machine. Sometimes you just fuck shit up because you can, and you should stop that thing so that you can take a second, and then the next thing you better do is go out and organize, folks, and then remind yourself that the rebuilding does not happen to scale. The rebuilding happens, we have broken down in our level of humanity. My biggest victories don't happen because I win a policy or because we pass this particular law, but because in the process of doing so, we transform our ability to look at one another in ways that we didn't think we had the possibility of doing. We transform the belief that we had the capacity and appetite to make change, and that everything that we do right now builds the process for bigger wins later, and that those things are essential just for your basic human development and your ability to push back, and the recognition that power cannot respond locally. Power can respond at scale, and we can do a lot by pushing through the edges. So yeah, sure, whatever monster is sitting in the DOJ, we're gonna freaking elect a DA in Philadelphia that's a lifelong civil rights defense attorney who's not gonna support the death penalty, who's going to end mass incarceration, and we're gonna close down a prison in our lifetime, in a term of office. We can have Betsy DeVos sit as the Secretary of Education, and we'll reclaim our public schools. We'll destroy a privatization agenda that was sold to us for 17 years, and we'll think about a different possibility.
Thank you.
And now you see why I depicted Helen as one of the heroines in my latest book, Reclaiming Gotham, in terms of what's happening at the local level in cities across not only the United States, but in cities across the world, in terms of progressive and radical movements coming to power in different cities, in places like, Chokwa Ansar Lumumba in Jackson, and Ras Baraka in Newark, and Gail McLaughlin in California, and Lisa Bender in Minneapolis, and Greg Kassar in San Antonio. All these, in Austin. All these local leaders came out of grassroots movements, are seizing local control at the municipal level. But the problem that we have is that across the advanced world, the regional and national governments are becoming increasingly conservative. So we are having this problem that the cities are more tolerant, whether it's sanctuary cities or police accountability or pre-kindergarten classes or affordable housing. The cities are trying to fashion a more inclusive, democratic approach to governance, but the national governments and the state governments are going in the opposite direction. They're going anti-immigrant, they're going white supremacist, they're going they're seeking to preempt local governments from being able to make policy. And so we're seeing the cities of America heading on a collision course with the national and the regional, and other countries, the regional governments. And that's one of the things that I don't think we in the media have really begun to piece together what is happening. And I think that that's what's so important about these grassroots leaders. Now it's percolating up. It percolated up in this last election to the congressional level. Right? We're seeing major changes at the congressional level, but still not at the levers of power of state governments and national governments. And that's where the press can play such a critical role, especially at the local level. I mean, I've always said, decentralize the media. Decentralize them. And if you look at the history of the American media system, that has been the principal battle throughout the history of the American press, centralization versus decentralization, because it's the very process of building America. Remember, it was a settler state, and it kept adding states. So therefore, every time settlers went to a different territory and tried to gain statehood, they had to create their own newspapers and their own press to communicate. And so Congress originally always supported localism in the press because they understood that this was an amalgamation of states. And the United States has always had a very decentralized press system. Capitalism has sought increasingly to centralize news distribution. From the development of the telegraph, through radio, through television and cable, it always started out as a decentralized system that was then centralized by political decisions. So I think that the media, we have to continue to battle for the decentralized media, local control, diversified media, and any attempt to centralize the system is an attempt to stamp out democracy and to stamp out dissident views. So we've got to, as media professionals, always think, is this in favor of centralization of news and information, or is this in favor of decentralization? Decentralization is democratic, centralization is authoritarian. Simple, not complex at all. But then we have to figure out how every new technology, we have to fight the same battle all over again with the new technology.
What I want to do from this point is take maybe two questions, and I'll let you say the questions first, and then we'll have our panelists respond as they think, just to get more people in. So, do we have some questions? Okay. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I'm wondering if all of you touched on the sort of global dimension of power.
Speak up just a little bit to make sure.
All of you touched on the global dimension of power. How the sort of discourse around solidarity is either abstract or superficial. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about your kind of vision and plan for what global solidarity looks like.
Okay, and then we'll take one other question just to get it in the room. All the way in the back, yes.
Yeah, to follow up on your great point just now, basically, like you mentioned, that there's a disconnect between the local and urban level to the regional and national level, and media has a lot of role to play for it, especially in the U.S. You have basically Fox News and conservative talk radio, which is buttressing the existing political establishment on the conservative side. So with that, as you mentioned, new technologies, obviously the advent of independent media is there to basically oppose that. But how do we exactly expanded in a sense where capital will never be in favor of media, which is against leftist goals, and in that sense, there's always like an inherent disadvantage on how you can reach people and ultimately achieve the political goals which that medium needs for that.
Thank you. Anyone want to,
I don't know who wants to.
well, Juan, why don't you?
No, I just talk, so somebody else should go ahead.
On the solidarity piece, I think about solidarity in a lot of ways, and I've been in my work more recently. I've been trying to write and think about the various ways the solidarity practices play out. I was talking about this actually at a slot the other day. I think one, I think about the kind of ethical dimensions of solidarity. What's at stake when we make a decision to stand in alignment with someone as an ally? Not to simply to say, well, actually, before I get to the ethical piece, and I'll be fast, I promise. One, I think there has to be a kind of analysis of the interconnectedness of our struggles and our oppression, right? I think there has to be some kind of analysis of that, right? So that we don't allow the very arbitrary political imaginary of the nation state to be the kind of predicate for how we understand our respective communities or our respective political commitments. In other words, white supremacy is a global project. So fighting it demands a certain kind of solidarity, I think, but before I get there, I have to have the analysis of what it means for me to be in East Jerusalem and look at Afro-Palestinian skin bleaching in the same way that they are in Ghana. In the same, so, and then I come here and I might not see skin bleaching as such, but I see a whole bunch of other stuff that's of the same sort. The normalization of certain kinds of tactics and practices. When I look at the formation of ethno-states around the world and I look at what's happening here, when I look at the kind of the narratives around we can't let these people in, the kind of moral panics we often have about immigrants, or particular immigrants, populations, I think about those things as part of a global system, not just of capital, but also of white supremacy. And so my solidarity is partly rests upon a certain kind of understanding of the interconnectedness of it, but it doesn't stop there. Because there are oppressions of a certain sort that aren't connected to oppressions of other sorts. And I still need to stand in solidarity with you. I need to stand in solidarity as an ethical project, as a humanistic project. And so for me, solidarity is also contingent upon that, but some of the discourses around solidarity that I hear don't necessarily reflect that. I've been studying a great deal Black Palestinian solidarity since, from the 1967 war until now. And at various moments, sometimes it's been the collective analysis. The Panthers would say, hey, the colonial project is a global one. The neo-colonial project is a global one. We have to stand in solidarity. Sometimes it's these people are like us. And when we say, these people are like us and therefore we must intervene, I think it can promote a certain kind of narrow, parochial, even tribalism that becomes dangerous when I want to stand for Kosovars. Or when I want to stand against anti-Semitism.
They're not like us.
Because they're not like me. However I constitute meanness, right, in that particular junction. If it's on race, if it's on religion, if it's on gender, whatever the thing might be, I want to stand with people because they're oppressed, not because they're of the same sort. So, but sometimes the discourse becomes too transactional for me. They stood up for us, so we'll stand up for them. In Ferguson, we saw a lot of the, people are wearing keffiyeh in Ferguson and telling us how to wipe our eyes out with tear gas, which is great. And now we're going to go over there and help them too. And so it becomes almost you stand up for us, we stand up for you, which for me becomes problematic because it reduces it to a transaction, it reduces it to an exchange value, and it limits our ability to help folk who may not have as much to give, right? It still becomes a kind of market logic, which becomes very scary and dangerous to me. So when I think about my solidarity, I try to always think about how can I engage in ways that are most ethical, most human, and that are informed by a very particular analysis of what's possible for us as a global project. There was one more piece about solidarity that I really wanted to say, and my brain is freezing, but it was super important, and I promise it was awesome. But maybe I'll come back to it, but it was really important. It wasn't awesome, but it was important. Shit. Okay, I'm sorry.
That was great. Yeah.
That's amazing. I guess part of it is that for me, it's a lot about solidarity is about practice as much as it is about analysis. And I think that is extremely hard. I mean, you can't just talk about solidarity. You actually have to do it, which is why I think the revitalization and the attention to the organizing tradition and the ways it's it is practiced within diverse communities is an extremely important aspect of us to understand how to push back against, hyper-capitalization and marketizing and privatization, et cetera. I was just thinking that in
There we go.
got it. In Philadelphia, for example, it matters to us that, the whole round of corporate education reform just travels from city to city, like after we got, Paul Vallis from Philadelphia, he went to Haiti, for God's sakes, we're exporting these ideas and importing them back. And so, I do also think about how, we had indigenous communities come to us from Mexico and talking about how we brought back language to public schools and how they were looking to do it. When we were talking about the privatization battle in our public schools, I certainly looked at India and the privatization over water and the fight over that. So the challenge here is not to over focus in on the power structures that are defining you, but try to seek out the organizing traditions in smaller communities that were able to push back. And that is, you can't read about them all the time. So those connections actually come through the relationships, which come through the practicing of solidarity across different groups, because then those people make those connections to you. So it goes back again to practice. You have to kind of do it. Here in Philadelphia, I think it's been really amazing to have journalism as Juan said, the loss of mainstream newspapers here in Philadelphia had, significant impact on the inability to hold power accountable. On the other hand, it opened up space for communities to create their own news and media. We created the public school notebook because we didn't have a means of reading about education stories. We needed to elevate more people to counter the superintendents and the governors and the mayors who said that nothing was possible for us. MMP was another outlet in which we pulled all of our stories together, and that we couldn't understand the education space if we didn't understand the mass incarceration and criminal justice space, if we didn't understand privatization and et cetera. So we had to be in all the places where those things are.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to say a few things. There may not be a direct answer to the questions, but I think it's worthwhile hearing it. I worked as a reporter here for 10 years at the Philadelphia Daily News. And in 1985, we had a strike that lasted 5 weeks at the Inquirer and the Daily News against the Knight Ridder Company. We won one of the best settlements. I think it was the last great economic settlement that any newspaper union received in the United States. We won 6% increases in wages each year for 3 years, 6, 6, and 6. We won a pension that started, it was reduced from age 65 to age 62. Right? So I worked at the Philadelphia Daily News not quite 10 years, 9.5 years. I'm now approaching 72. For the last 10 years, I've been collecting a pension. It's not a big pension, but a small pension from the Philadelphia Daily News at a newspaper that I only worked for 9 years, 9.5 years, right? And I will continue to receive that pension. I mean, the pension has some problems, but they'll continue to pay out, right? This was the kind of, these media companies had so much money that if the workers were organized well enough, they could get really decent wages and decent pensions and have decent income to be able to do the kind of reporting that we were doing. So I think that there's enormous potential. One, it shows about the power of unionization, but also the power of understanding how you can get these companies to share the wealth that they, right now there's, Google and Facebook and Twitter, all these companies are Comcast. They are making so much money. It's unbelievable how much money these companies are making. And if we could only organize the workers in these places to really exact from these owners the kinds of decent pay and decent benefits, we'd go a long way toward democratizing the media system in terms of the internal, also, I want to say that Ralph Nader had a great, Nader had an interview recently about the Boeing 737 catastrophe. And he said something that stuck in my mind. He talked about the arrogance of the algorithm, right? The arrogance to believe that you can craft a code or an algorithm that can make human beings unnecessary. And I think we, in the 60s, I go back to those periods, back to the days of the Panthers and the Lords, we used to have a saying, the spirit of the people is greater than a man's technology. And all the technology eventually gets taken over by the man, no matter what the revolutionary ideas of the people who created the technology. As soon as it can make money, these companies will buy it up, right? So it all eventually becomes the man's technology. So we have to always focus on that. The spirit of the people is greater than the man's technology. No matter what systems they come up with to further exploit the population, people will find a way to organize and resist. And if you don't have that faith that people will find a way, then you become a pessimist. If you have the faith that people can get together and organize and resist, change will occur. And I think that's the key thing that journalists have to figure out, how to tell the narratives of people who are resisting.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Could I just come back to your question or your idea about centralization of the media and how we get back to looking at local and state? I taught state and local government for a long time, and I was fascinated by the ignorance of the students about state and local government. And I attribute that to this centralization, that the only elections that were looked at were presidential elections. And you look at the President of the United States, you don't know who the mayor necessarily is of your city, but you certainly don't know anything about state government. So this last part of the Trump effect, I have seen grassroots movements come up to recognize how important the state is, how important it is to elect people at the two other levels of government. So I was very involved in the Turn PA Blue movement last year. There was no coverage of that movement, that grassroots movement, locally, zero. And it was very successful anyway, but even after the success, it wasn't covered by media. So I'm asking you if this can ever change.
Well, I think that's one of the issue of the deserts of local media is I think is the fundamental question. It's not really at the national level. There will always be both commercial and non-commercial operations, whether it's ProPublica or Democracy Now, and the commercial operations to cover the national politics. But the real problem is at the local level. How do you build the infrastructure of local news, whether it's non-commercial or commercial? And I agree with Victor that our efforts should be on non-commercial. But we've got to figure out a revenue stream and a model to really build local news, so that people understand who's on their school board, what's the zoning, what are the developers up to locally in terms of zoning for housing and the public schools versus the charter schools and all of these important decisions that affect people's lives, but no one's reporting on them. And then that gets doubled up at the state level where the legislatures are basically organized rackets these days because there's no one covering what's going on at the state legislatures. So, that's the real, to me, that's the critical issue. How do you build local news to report on these local struggles and to inform people about what their elected officials are doing at the local level?
Mark, could you comment on that question? Do you have any thoughts on that?
He hit the nail right on the head. Honestly, I'm fascinated by that. I was actually thinking about, again, I agree with all that, but I was actually thinking about it in the global context, how I'm noticing the same challenges everywhere. You know, I mean, obviously, I've been thinking a lot about Sudan lately. Obviously, local media is not, the issue isn't local media not trying to cover it, but rather that there was a repressive regime preventing them from covering it. But I'm looking at other nation states, and I'm seeing this challenge of local media covering these events, and people don't necessarily understand what's at stake. I spent the summer in Jerusalem looking at media representations of the municipal elections which came up. And I mean, part of it, there are a lot of complexities about municipal elections in Jerusalem in terms of whether people even want to vote in them for a lot of reasons. But even the story of what's at stake, like people knew much more about what was happening in the Knesset, they understood much more what was happening at the national level, and they understood what was happening at the local level. And trying to figure out how to leverage local media in ways that obviously aren't outside of the reach of the state, because to Juan's point, the state gets it eventually, power gets it eventually. But how can we keep them at arm's length enough to be able to do interesting, principled work of resistance? Is the thing that I'm constantly trying to think of. And so I get excited by solutions journalism. I get excited by citizen media. I get excited by all of these mechanisms, you know, what Clemente Rodriguez is doing. I mean, in Colombia, like all of these things are ways to provide spaces and sites of resistance against the backdrop. The only thing I would add really quickly, which is what I was thinking about before, is that when we're looking for examples of the local in a global context, sometimes we think about our solidarity practice and our focus on local media, and when we look for lessons, it's often west to east. It's often global north to global south. And the idea of thinking more deeply about the kind of south-south solidarity and the south-south lessons is really fascinating. Like, what does resistance in Omdurman in Sudan have to teach Egypt? What does Egypt have to teach Syria, et cetera? And what lessons can we learn from south-south global collaborations? How can we learn from those spaces? I think because we're so geared to be centered in our own local context, that many of the lessons we have about how to reimagine media, how to reimagine resistance are very local and parochial. And I think we have a lot to learn from casting our net much more widely.
Absolutely.
Can I add one quick thing?
Of course.
For all the folks who are in this room, I mean, one of the things that is also really powerful is helping communities get more media savvy. So, you know, it doesn't all have to be us waiting for everything. I think one of the most powerful things about Ferguson was the ability for extremely media savvy, but also people who are really right on the ground doing something that elevated something to a moment where the media couldn't turn away. So there is the ability for folks in this room to help communities that are organizing right now to get to the point where you're helping tell the stories, that this is a media that is driven by markets, attention, you know, short attention spans, but there's also an ability to capture it. Like, I came out of journalism, so I think like that is part of the reason why, you know, we drive towards trying to draw attention to the stories that we're doing. It's how you win a Fair Work Week. That's how Chinatown gets onto the front pages of the paper, so that you begin to be in a space where people can't turn away from you.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's just have a round of applause one more time for our panelists. I just want to very quickly thank everybody who has come together to make this, to launch a real success. Thanks certainly to Todd and Victor, to Jonathan and John Jackson and our deans, and Michael Del Carpini who made this possible, to Breyer, big hand for Breyer for organizing everything.